Good day to you too, my fellow humanoids. What we go over today is yet another recap, this time around about Mythic Plus. Because the last time we saw each other talking about the Mythic Plus situation as well as the current week was a couple of weeks ago, right as we were entering a couple of very lenient weeks of Mythic Plus. As you know, Mythic Plus has 12 weeks, after which it is just going to reset to the first week. So a couple of weeks ago we entered the reset. We started with week 1, which was Fortified, Bursting and Storming, and then the following week, which was last week, we had Tyrannical, Raging and Volcanic. Those were 2 very nice weeks for pushing keys, and we were able to experience them in full, because the last time we saw these 2 weeks, it was 3 months ago. It was right as the patch launched. One of those weeks, Mythic Plus item level, for example, was still capped, so you couldn't push, you couldn't go as high as you could. You were still learning the new seasonal affix, for example, whereas the last couple of weeks we were able to see in full display how easy those weeks were. And it's worth mentioning because right now, on the other hand, we are entering a pretty nasty set of weeks for Mythic Plus. The week we are currently in, Fortified, Inspiring and Grievous, is already pretty annoying in and of itself. What makes it worse is that the next week it's gonna be Tyrannical, Spiteful and Necrotic, which is even worse, and the week after that is going to be Fortified, Bolstering and Quaking. So we get in front of us a pretty demoralizing set of weeks for Mythic Plus, but I guess that is the price to pay to have such nice weeks back to back. Now, about the Mythic Plus itself. So there are a few news to point out today. And by the way, at this point, these types of videos are basically the equivalent of your housewives' gossip, sipping some red wine at 10 in the morning with all of the other stay-at-home moms and trophy wives, chatting about who they heard, talking about who, shit-talking who is cheating on who. This is basically what we are doing here, except in Mythic Plus format, talking a little bit about all of the things that are changing, mostly because, there isn't really much else to do, so might as well kill some time with these types of videos. Also because I get to look at some stats and some numbers, which is always interesting to me, so it comes very easily to make these types of videos. As I was saying, we do have a couple of firsts when it comes to this week, now that we have gone through a couple of weeks since the last time we saw each other, and we can update the situations. Now, the first situation is that I always like looking at the difference between, let's just say, the difference between all of the player base, so every type, every facet of player, and then the more competitive one. I don't want to say the elitist one or the hardcore one, because we are talking about players who do and compete and participate in keys at the plus 15 or higher level. So if we are going just by statistics, we are talking about roughly the top 25-ish% of players who engage in Mythic Plus, and it is always interesting to see how much of a difference there can be, even between just something as simple as specs being played and classes being played at that level, compared to all the other keys as a whole. Now, the first thing to point out is that finally, after we saw from our raid videos that Beast Mastery Hunters have passed in popularity Marksmanship Hunters, we also have basically the same thing when it comes to Mythic Plus. Now, Beast Mastery is also the more popular spec when it comes to Mythic Plus. It's the one you are, let's just say, more likely to encounter when you look at all of the keys, all of the levels and whatnot. Even if you go all the way up to the Mythic Plus 15 and higher keys, Beast Mastery is, just by a tiny bit, but it is also ahead of Marksmanship. Of course, when you go and look at the higher keys, for the more competitive level, the plus 20 keys, it is still Marksmanship, because the purpose of having a Hunter in keys that high is mostly their burst AoE damage that comes from a Hunter being Marksmanship with Wild Spirits. It's not as high if you're a Beast Mastery Hunter, so when you look at the higher keys, Marksmanship is still holding its own compared to Beast Mastery, but for all of the other lower keys, Beast Mastery now has the advantage when it comes to popularity. The same can be said for this type of drastic change between all of the player base and the more competitive side when you look at healers, because when you look at all of the healers combined, you see that 3 specs are standing out particularly, which is Holy Paladin, Resto Shaman, and Restoration Druid. Of course, the odd one out in this trio is Resto Druid. In raid encounters, for example, at the high level, Resto Druid is one of the least played, but in a heroic raiding, Resto Druid is the 3rd most played. When you look at Mythic Plus in keys higher than 20, Resto Druid is also not very played. It even has to fight with Holy Priest when it comes to popularity. But when you look at all of the player base, there are a lot of Resto Druids. It's interesting. I wonder where do they all go once they clear their +7 or their +9 or their +12s Mythic Plus keys. Why do they all disappear once you start getting past the 15 range? Do they all go Guardian or Balanced Druid, perhaps? That's an interesting question. Now, we also have, however, another first. This is more relevant because it's a historic first. So, for the melee DPS, we have known for a while that Fury Warrior, after getting buffed between January and February, they became more and more popular over time. But then, as the 9.1 patch came through, it was Arms Warrior that was buffed. Arms Warrior that grew to the point that it became the more popular and the more used spec at high level of content. So Mythic raiding, high level Mythic Plus keys, it was Arms Warrior that was making up most of the warrior representation. So when we go and look at all of the key levels for the melee DPS, Fury is still slightly ahead, but when you look at the more competitive keys, it's Arms that is making up more ground. The other thing, however, in this change is that for the longest time, Outlaw Rogue was the most popular rogue spec for Mythic Plus. And for longest time, I mean ever since Mythic Plus became a thing in Legion, it was Outlaw that was easily the most popular, sometimes even embarrassingly when you compared it to Assassination Rogue, which was basically nearly non-existent. However, we have reached the point where, first of all, at all key levels, it is very, very balanced amongst all rogues. You see the difference between the highest being Outlaw at 6.1% representation and the lowest one being Assassination at 4.5%. So it's very healthy. Players of all levels are pretty much playing all 3 specs equally. What is more interesting is that for the first time, when we look at the high level of keys, subtlety rogues are, for the moment, passing Outlaw. Now, if you have been looking at a few streams, perhaps a few videos of high-level keys being completed, you would have already been aware of this, right? You should have seen, generally, if you saw a rogue in a high key, there is a very, very good chance that the rogue you saw was going to be subtlety. However, as we have seen already, a certain spec being played a lot at the very, very high end doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the most played spec in the game. Like we have seen, for example, with Beast Mastery, which is basically the most popular spec in the game, it's not very popular at the high end. We have just seen that Fury Warriors are still very popular, even though most high-level warriors are going to be Arms. We can make the same discussion for Resto Druids, for example, being very popular. But Outlaw was particularly resilient in dropping their top spot when it came to rogue specs at the high level. But finally, they have been overtaken by subtlety, which is fair because it is more and better reflecting of the current situation of rogues in Mythic Plus, where subtlety is performing better than Outlaw. There are other specs you can go for when you're looking at good and heavy consistent AoE damage. At the moment, Elemental Shaman and Frost Mage are doing that job. You don't really need an extra Outlaw Rogue helping you with that, so it's good that subtlety is taking up a spot now over Outlaw. Now, however, there is also another change, which is possibly, as far as numbers are concerned, pretty much the biggest swap we can see between all of the key levels and the more competitive side, which is why I'm also going to ask you exactly what's going on, if you are part of this, if you had any hand in what's happening here. I'm talking about Warlocks. So at all levels, at all keys, overall throughout all of the player base, even in raid encounters, heroic difficulty to be able to see the vastest amount of the player base, Destruction Warlock is the more popular one, okay? It's the more used. Now, it's very confusing, of course, because when you go and look at the higher level of raiding, most of the time you're going to be seeing Affliction Warlocks where a lot of AoE is being included in the fight, or Demonology if it's a very single target focused fight. There is not really a lot of Destro, but for some reason they are the most popular in raid encounters. When we look at Mythic Plus, the situation is kind of the same. Destruction is still the most popular spec for Warlocks overall. Now, even if we look at keys higher than 15, so anywhere from 15 to 20, 22, 24, Destruction still is the most popular of the specs. Not even by a drastically lower margin. They are going from 9.1 to 8.6. So they are still very, very represented. However, when we go into the plus 20 range, so the more high level keys, the top dog in this situation becomes Affliction in almost a 1-to-1 swap. Because in keys higher than 15, 8.6% are Destruction, and in keys higher than 20, 8.3% are Affliction. So there is almost a full swap between the Destruction Warlocks populating all of the lower level keys and then the Affliction Warlocks being in the keys at a more higher level. This is a similar explanation to something like Beast Mastery and Marksmanship. At that level of a high key, the purpose of having a Warlock in the group is to be Affliction and do a lot of AoE. So you wouldn't need / you wouldn't want a Destruction Warlock for that group, because you want just a lot of AoE, which is what an Affliction Warlock is going to bring. It is just interesting to see that the drastic difference that there can be between normal keys, 12, 14, 16, and then the higher keys, the more competitive keys, to see such a drastic change between the specs priority for the groups. Meanwhile, as far as the performance is concerned, not too much that can be gauged from Warcraft logs. As you know, when you check out the overall performance of a spec in Mythic Plus, first of all, it's a very broad term, talking about the performance of a player from a Mythic Plus log. But more importantly, it is also going to change quite drastically based on the key level, based on the week, because the easier the week, the easier for you to push and the better the score is going to look. Even then, most of the situation has remained unchanged. There has been the slight difference when it comes to healers. We left a couple of weeks ago talking about how Restoration Shaman was getting even with Holy Paladin. Now, in the last couple of weeks, the situation has reversed a little bit. Shaman has still remained ahead of Discipline, the third better performing spec in Mythic Plus, but not as low as they were before. They have, just temporarily tied together with Holy Paladin. This is one of the cool things we will be able to see in 9.1.5, because at the moment, for example, nearly 60% of Shamans are Necrolord. That's because a ton of PvE competitive players are going to be raiding, and if they are raiding, they are mostly going to be going Necrolord. However, in Mythic Plus, Shaman going Kyrian is going to be performing much better. So when 9.1.5 comes out, it is going to be much easier for all of the Necrolord Shamans, such as myself, for example, to just freely go Kyrian so they can perform better in Mythic Plus while being Kyrian, which is something right now they cannot do. Meanwhile, for other specs, like for example Holy Paladin, which is already at the top, not much is going to change, because their better performance in Mythic Plus is already highlighted by being able to be Ventir. So even if they can freely respec to another Covenant in the next patch, they're not really going to improve in a Mythic Plus setting, whereas Resto Shaman will have the opportunity to respec to a better performing Covenant for Mythic Plus. The same can be said for some of the other specs, particularly the DPS ones. The tanks have not really changed too much. We still have the split. We still have the divide between the three on the high end, which are the Guardian Druid, the Brewmaster Monk, the Vengeance Demon Hunter, and then the bottom three being Blood DK, Protection Paladin, and Protection Warrior. It is still worth mentioning, however, that this is still the most balanced situation we have had in a long time for tanks. We do have, for example, the current top group when it comes to pushing Mythic Plus, having a Prot Paladin, for example. We do also have a couple of Prot Warriors being at a very, very high level in clearing keys. We, of course, have Guardian Druids and Vengeance Demon Hunters, as well as Brewmaster tanks being at a pretty high level. So we are in a pretty even state, in a pretty balanced state when it comes to tanks. So these types of performance levels don't really tell the whole story on how smooth, I guess, competitive and balanced the situation is when it comes to tanks. It is a little bit more telling, however, when it comes to DPS, when it comes to the difference in performance between the DPS specs, starting from the range DPS. The one at the top showing a better than average level of performance is Fire Mage, whereas the two specs at the bottom are Destruction and Demonology. The second best being Affliction, and then you have a big clump in the middle. Talking about the most popular spec in the game being Beast Mastery, that's the third weakest range DPS spec when it comes to performance in Mythic Plus. Again, you can take this with a grain of salt. For example, the line sort of losing itself in that tangle in the middle of Frost Mage is currently the most popular spec at high keys when it comes to range DPS. So it's not that just because you see this, it's like, I guess Frost Mage is mediocre in Mythic Plus. Similar types of correlations can be made for the melee DPS. At the very least, we do see Subtlety Rogue here being finally rewarded in its popularity since they just passed Outlaw. Also because their performance is the highest one in Mythic Plus. It shows as being the highest for quite a few weeks. Windwalker and Outlaw itself are the other two outliers that have been showing very highly in performance, and unfortunately we do also have the outlier in the lower side of performance, which is Red Paladin. It still is overall a better situation than we had in Season 1, however. This is likely something worth making its own video later on, probably later on in the week, which is the difference between the melee and the range DPS. If you remember, we started Season 1 and I had some points to make on the fact that range DPS were taking over. We started with the notion, we started with the idea that range DPS are supposed to be more popular in raiding, whereas melee DPS are supposed to be more popular in Mythic Plus. That's at least what we had in Legion, what we had in BFA. We had specs like Outlaw, like Windwalker, like Havoc, sometimes like Unholy DK being very popular in Mythic Plus, and then you go into the raid and it's Shadow Priest, it's Balanced Druid, it's Mages and Hunters being very used. But then Shadowlands started and we saw combinations like Fire Mage plus Balanced Druid in Mythic Plus groups at the top level. In the worst cases, we had Fire Mage, Balanced Druids and Marksmanship Hunters. You know, it was a complete disaster for the melee DPS. So we didn't start too well in the expansion when it comes to the balancing of the ranged versus the melee, but over time it has gotten much more even. You have seen, if you have followed this channel, I'm sure you've already seen my points about how the melee DPS are doing much better in the raid. We kept mentioning how specs like Arms, Windwalker, all three rogue specs, Feral Druid are all showing up in the top of performance when it comes to raid encounters, and they are all melee specs. And now in Mythic Plus groups, we have gotten back to the status quo, which is most of the time when you split your DPS, you're gonna go for 2 melee and 1 ranged, and then sometimes 2 ranged, 1 melee. Very rarely you see a group of triple ranged. Nowadays you see groups like a Windwalker, a Rogue and a Mage, sometimes a Demon Hunter, a Balanced Druid and a Mage, or maybe a Demon Hunter, a Windwalker and an Elemental Shaman. So it has gotten much more even over time compared to how we started the expansion, which is thumbs up. It's a good state right now when it comes to the popularity of the two different types of DPS. And also, if you want to be honest, even in the diversity. I said that melee used to be more popular in Mythic Plus in the older expansions, but if you wanted to be more honest, it was Havoc and Outlaw Rogue that were dominating Mythic Plus. It's not that there was much window for many other melee DPS specs, whereas nowadays, even with the melee DPS making up more ground again, you can see Windwalkers, but you can also see Subtlety Rogues, you can see Outlaw Rogues, you can see Havoc, Demon Hunters, hunters, and you can see arms warriors. So it has gotten more varied. The same can be said for ranged. I'm saying that the ranged were more popular when in reality it was fire mage, for example, for a lot of BFA, or balanced druid, whereas now you are seeing elemental shamans again, and now it's frost mage over fire mage. There is also some affliction warlocks as well showing up, so it has gotten more diverse, which is good. It's nice. It opens up more window for more diversity and more variety of specs. There is still room for improvement, no doubt. There are still several specs that can only dream of being accepted in 18, 19, or even plus 20 keys, but okay, let's just not ask too much, lest Blizzard start nerfing some of these specs even more, okay? Now that we've gone through this recap of Mythic Plus for this week, this new week, which is going to herald a pretty horrible streak of 3 Mythic Plus weeks back to back that are going to be pretty nasty to go through, we can stop. We can take a break. Thank you, as usual, for watching the video. If you've enjoyed the content on this channel, you can leave a comment down below. You can like the video as well as subscribing to the channel. Thank you guys for watching the video. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, oh man, it's getting better and better. Yesterday it was long pants and today it's a hoodie. The colder the better, almost literally.